Hello guys, this Science of Sport video is part of the BTEC Sport and Exercise Sciences Unit 2 Functional Anatomy series of videos. And this is the second in 4 videos that looks at the B1 location, anatomy and function of the cardiovascular components. So learning at AIM B. This part 2, is all about blood vessel structure and function. So the specification requires you to know the location of, i.e. where some of these vessels are. So these top 4 are actual named vessels: the aorta, the vena cava, the pulmonary artery and the pulmonary vein. They're the 4 vessels that connect directly with the heart. So you'll need to know where they are located. You'll also need to understand the anatomy of the 5 different kinds of blood vessel, so how they are structured and how that links to the functions that they have. So arteries, arterioles, veins, venules and capillaries. You'll truthfully see the 2 different spellings of venules. I tended to spell it like this, but your spec spells them like this. So these are 5 different types of blood vessel. And again, you'll need to know the structure and function of them. So just as a starting point, here's an overview of those 5 different types of blood vessel. You've got your arteries. And arteries and arterioles are typically coloured red on anatomical diagrams because mostly they contain oxygenated blood. There is an exception to that, and it's the pulmonary artery, but I'll come to that later. So for the most part, arteries transport oxygenated blood. From arteries, the blood will split into smaller vessels called arterioles, and hopefully you know about arterioles from other sections already, the muscular system, etc. You should hopefully also know that the tiniest blood vessels we have are capillaries, and they have a very specific function. Venules are what transport blood away from capillary beds, so all the capillary network, and venules drain blood away from those capillaries and ultimately into the veins that transport blood back to the heart. Typically, blood in veins is deoxygenated. The exception to that is also the pulmonary vein, and again I'll show you that later. So broadly speaking, we've got arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules and veins. To give you again another sense of the flow of blood visually, so you may know the name of the cardiovascular system. So this whole section is on the cardiovascular system. The cardio part of that name refers to the heart. And the first video was all about the heart, cardio. Vascular refers to vessels. So this is the path of blood through the different types of vessels that I've just named. So from the heart, blood is ejected into the aorta. That's the specific name of the biggest artery. Then from the aorta, this main artery will get smaller arteries and smaller arteries as blood is diverted all over the body to the different body systems, eventually becoming arterioles, these branches of smaller arteries, again basically. And the arterioles are very important in terms of directing the blood, allowing flow or restricting flow into capillary beds. Our smallest vessels, as we've said already, are the capillary beds, and they have a really critical role of gaseous exchange. From there, the blood will be slightly more deoxygenated depending on what's going on, and will drain from the capillary beds into venules, which ultimately drain blood back into the veins. You have, smaller, bigger veins, and then you have your main vena cava or vena cava vein, which takes blood back into the right atrium. And then from there, so this is what we would call the systemic circuit, from the heart out to the systems and back to the heart. From there, of course, the right ventricle would eject the blood and pump it to the lungs, the pulmonary circuit, where the blood would reoxygenate, come back into the left atrium and start this journey all over again. So this journey here that you can see on this diagram is just the systemic circuit. It doesn't show the pulmonary circuit where blood goes up to be reoxygenated again, because the focus of this is the types of blood vessels. So just to start off, let's look more at the structure of the different vessels. This is a nice starting point. So the central diagram here is an anatomical diagram of or an image of a vein and an artery. So the first thing to notice is that the space inside the vein, which we call the lumen, is much bigger in a vein than in an artery. The lumen of an artery is relatively small. I'll explain more about the function of the two vessels to account for that, but firstly just observe that there's a difference in the size of the space, the size of the tube basically. We're talking about tubes, vessels that blood flows through. The second thing to observe is the thickness of this part of the wall of an artery. So this has a thick, muscular, smooth muscle layer. The vein does have a muscular layer, but it's relatively thin. So the orangey type layer there is the thin muscular layer, relatively thin. And overall, the diameter of an artery is less than the diameter of a vein. So the veins are actually larger vessels. Sometimes I think it's natural to think it the other way around, but veins are actually bigger vessels, but the arteries have a much thicker muscular wall. And these two outside diagrams, so this is the diagram of an artery showing the inner, the middle, and the outer or external layer of an artery. And similarly, here's the inner, the middle, and the outer layer of a vein. And this again illustrates that the artery has a thicker muscular wall. The middle layer, the tunica media, is the muscular wall, smooth muscle. Smooth muscle. Both of them have it, but the artery is thicker. Okay, so this is those three layers, the tunica externa, the tunica media, and the tunica intima, are the three layers of any blood vessel. Some vessels, as I said, have more or less of those layers, and we're going to look at that shortly. Just giving you a little bit more detail about them. So the tunica intima, the internal layer, this would be our endothelial layer. You hopefully from the respiratory system know that capillaries are one cell thick. They only have this endothelium layer, these endothelial cells. That is the thin one cell thick wall of a capillary. So capillaries don't have a tunica externa and don't have a tunica media. There's no smooth muscle on a capillary. There's no outer, more sort of fibrous layer, protective layer on a capillary. We want the walls of capillaries to be thin, so they just have a tunica media. So just this slide really, pause the video and have a look at the detail given here. We've got this thin endothelial layer. We want this inside layer to be smooth and so that the blood can pass through the inside of this tube easily. That's logical. We want this middle layer, this muscular, smooth muscle layer, to be able to constrict and vasodilate. We again know that from our earlier work in some of the other systems, when it was looking at types of muscle tissue. We know smooth muscle can constrict or dilate. So that's the job of this middle tunica media layer. And then the outer layer, those vessels that have the outer layer, and it's not every vessel that does, it's designed basically to be fibrous and a bit tough, a bit stronger. So it's protective for the vessels themselves. Obviously, with an artery or a vein, we don't want them to be particularly easily damaged because losing arterial blood is hugely problematic. So we have a fibrous outer layer to try to protect the vessels. So inner smooth, thin and smooth to allow blood to flow or to allow gases through in case of the capillaries. Middle layer, tunica media, smooth muscle, depending on which vessel it has more or less smooth muscle to enable us to constrict and dilate. Tunica externa, outer layer, those vessels that have it, it's there to be protective and strong and sort of tough. So let's look at the 5 different types of vessel and see which vessels have which layers. Let's look at the sort of middle section here to start off with. So the endothelial inner tunica intima layer. Each vessel has it. Every vessel has that smooth inner layer. Please note that the capillary only has that one layer, one cell thick layer. We know that already. That's because it needs to be thin to allow gas exchange, and it's semi-permeable to allow the important gases to move through it easily. The arterioles have the tunica intima and some smooth muscle. You hopefully know already that arterioles can vasoconstrict and dilate, and they're really important for determining where blood flows. They do not have an outer layer, a fibrous layer. They don't have a tunica externa. Venules have the intima layer and the externa layer. So they have tunica intima, tunica externa. They don't have smooth muscle. Then the arteries and the veins have all 3 layers. They have the tunica intima, the tunica media, the smooth muscle, and the tunica externa, the fibrous layer. We need to protect these vessels. We do not want blood loss, particularly from our arteries, but nor from our veins. You will lose a lot of blood. Again, the other thing to note is that the arteries have more muscle. They have more smooth muscle than the veins, although the veins do have smooth muscles, because veins can constrict, but they also have more elastic muscle. And that's because of the amount of pressure. The blood is going through arteries at high pressure, and we need the arteries to expand, to stretch and then recoil. So after the blood's gone through and it's stretched, we need that vessel to recoil back to its normal size, and therefore we need some more elastic tissue there, elastic muscle there. So this is quite a nice overview of the structure of the different vessels, showing that they all have the tunica intima. Arterioles and capillaries don't have the tunica externa. Capillaries only have the tunica intima. They don't have any of the other 2 layers. And then, of course, our arteries and veins have all 3 layers, but arteries have more. You can see here the diameters. So veins and arteries have the biggest diameter, 5 millimeters and 4 millimeters, and then relatively the other 3 are small, so these are micrometers, much smaller. The thickness of the wall, the arteries have the thickest wall, the vein of 1 millimeter, the veins have the next thickest wall of 0.5 millimeter, and then the other 3 vessels, arterioles are next, and then the capillaries, tiny, venules a little bit thicker. So again, that gives you a nice overview of the structure. And just to sort of finish that part of it, really looking at the 3 layers, this shows both artery, veins and capillaries in terms of their layers. So let's look at each of the 5 types of blood vessel in detail. So arteries to start off with then. These are obviously critical in distributing blood. They tend to carry oxygenated blood, and you can see on the diagram on the right here, from the heart, from the left ventricle, blood will leave the main artery, the aorta, and you need to be able to identify that vessel. Please note that from the left ventricle, blood is ejected upwards into the aorta and it loops away, and that's called the aortic arch. So the aorta leaves the left ventricle carrying oxygenated blood and then going off all over the body to distribute blood to the various areas of the body and the various systems, the lower limbs, the upper body, the upper limbs. You can see a slightly more realistic version of this on the left-hand diagram. So the heart here is the aorta, leaving the ventricle and going up into the aortic arch, and then from this main artery, it's almost like your main motorway on a road map. This is the main motorway, and the other arteries, the other major arteries, branch off it. And then from those arteries, we get smaller arteries. So the arterial network actually has to obviously extend all over our body to distribute this oxygenated blood from the heart. But looking at the structure then, you have to, all anatomy is about structure and function. How something is built is connected to the job it has to do, the role it plays. I don't think that for your specification you need to know too much detail about the different types of arteries. There are some arteries that are more elastic and some that are more muscular. So I would suggest we just focus on this sort of top part here. So the elastic arteries are arteries that need to be elastic because they need to cope with an expansion as blood goes through them, and then they need to recoil when the blood has passed. So you often feel your pulse by feeling an artery, and you feel the lump that you feel when you feel your pulse is blood being pushed through an artery. And the lump is because when the blood goes through, the artery expands a bit, and then when it's gone, it recoils and goes back to its normal size. And that's effectively your pulse. So we need the walls, we need to have some elastic tissue, an elastic layer in an elastic muscular layer in the walls of arteries to cope with the expansion and the recoil, each time the heart pumps blood through them. So we've established that they're structured with thick muscular walls, a thick tunica media, which has both muscle, smooth muscle and elastic tissue to account for blood being sent from the heart at high velocity and under high pressure. It's again a bit like turning on the tap on full and a hose pipe that has to cope with that highest pressure right by the tap. And your arteries have to expand and recoil. Now, you will need to know the names of the aorta, as we've said already, the main artery leaving your heart, which is coping with the blood at highest velocity and highest pressure. You'll also need to know the name of the pulmonary artery, the artery that carries blood away from the heart but to the lungs. So the aorta carries the blood away from the heart to the systems, the systemic circuit, to the body. The pulmonary artery carries blood away from the heart to the lungs. Pulmonary is lungs. So those are the two specific names of arteries that you'll need to know. The aortic blood is oxygenated. It's been to the lungs, it's come back into the left ventricle, into the left atrium, it's been ejected from the left ventricle and goes out in the aorta, out to the body to be used. The blood leaving the heart going into the pulmonary artery on the right side of the heart is blood that's returned from the body into the right atrium, has gone down into the right ventricle, and now needs to be pumped to the lungs to reoxygenate. So this pulmonary artery blood is more deoxygenated. The rule of arteries that is correct whatever is that arteries carry blood away from the heart. So arteries away from the heart. The aorta is away, the pulmonary artery carries blood away. Many arteries carry oxygenated blood, but not all, and the pulmonary artery is the one exception to that. So structurally, we have smooth muscle, elastic tissue, to cope with the function of the vessels, which is to deal with blood near the heart at high velocity, high pressure. It needs to be able to expand and recoil. So from your aorta, blood is distributed through smaller arteries and eventually gets down to smaller vessels again, our arterioles. And our arterioles feed blood into capillaries, and we call sort of a collective of capillaries a capillary bed or a capillary network. So here's the artery bringing blood down. Here's an arteriole that will direct the blood into a network of capillaries. And we could say that beneath or within this capillary bed, we've got muscles. From the capillary bed, we have venules taking blood away and going back into veins, back towards the heart, to take the deoxygenated blood away. So arterioles, so it goes arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, veins. So let's look more specifically at the structure of arterioles. Arterioles have only two of the three layers. They have the tunica intima, the inner endothelial layer. Remember, that is smooth to allow blood to flow easily through it. But they also have a tunica media, this smooth muscle, and you can see it looks wrapped around here. It's translated over here. Look, we've got the wrapped around smooth muscle, and we should know already that we can make this smooth muscle contract to constrict that blood vessel, and that's called vasoconstriction. When this smooth muscle contracts or constricts the vessel, the flow of blood through it is reduced. If this smooth muscle is not stimulated, or an impulse doesn't make it constrict or contract, it will be relaxed and it will be dilated, and that's called vasodilation. So arterioles have the capacity to be vasoconstricted and narrow the arteriole diameter, or vasodilated and widen the arteriole diameter. And obviously, whichever it's doing affects the flow of blood through it. If we needed blood to go into this capillary bed, let's say there was a muscle beneath this or connected to this capillary bed, and we needed oxygen to get to this muscle because I'm using this muscle, your brain would ensure that this arteriole was vasodilated to allow blood through. If we weren't active and we were at rest and we didn't need blood to go here, our brain would vasoconstrict this arteriole and limit the amount of blood that went into this capillary network, and it would redirect it elsewhere. It might pass on by and go into our visceral internal organs or our digestive system. So the arterioles, two things really, only two layers of the three, the intima and the media, the smooth muscle, as you can see in both of these diagrams. And because of that smooth muscle, it has the capacity to vasoconstrict and dilate. Constrict is when it's told to contract, tightens, narrows the vessel, or dilate is when it's basically not stimulated and it relaxes and it allows blood to flow into the capillary network. The other thing to be aware of is that you don't consciously do this. You automatically have this done for you. If you started using these muscles, your brain's very clever and will automatically do that. And again, you should know already that anything automatically controlled by your brain is via the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system would send impulses via sympathetic nerves to stimulate this smooth muscle to make it contract, and those impulses would stop if this muscle needed to vasodilate and relax. So the arterioles are controlled by the autonomic nervous system automatically for us via sympathetic nerves. Now I suggest you pause the video and have a look at this. I'm not going to read it all out or anything like that, but basically this text describes what I've talked about. Now we have a certain arterial tone, it's got a certain level of contraction. If we vasoconstrict, it tightens. If it vasodilates, it widens, and that shows it really nicely. This is normal, this is constricted, this is dilated, wider. Have a little browse through this, taking that, it basically says that in more detail. So let's look again to summarize the structure of arterioles. It has a tunica intima, the inner endothelial layer, smooth to let the blood flow through. It has the tunica media, the smooth muscular wall layer, not tunica externa, the fibrous protective layer. It's controlled by, this smooth muscle is controlled by the sympathetic nervous system, which is the stimulating part of the autonomic nervous system, and with that stimulation it's able to constrict, and without that stimulation it relaxes and dilates. So it's really central in controlling blood flow, where blood goes or not, and it's also really important for managing blood pressure. So if we have high blood pressure, our arterioles would vasodilate to widen the vessels and hopefully reduce pressure. If we had low blood pressure, they might constrict to try to increase the pressure of the blood within them. So they're really important for both blood flow, where blood goes, and also blood pressure, widening to reduce or constricting to increase blood pressure. There's one other part of the story that we need to add to this. So this is similar to the diagram I showed you before, showing an artery, an arteriole, and the constriction of arteriole to stop flow, or the dilation of an arteriole to allow flow. Now, the other thing that you need to identify, and works very much hand in hand with the arterioles to control blood flow, is something we call a pre-capillary sphincter. So it's shown here as almost like a little ring of muscle, like a donut of muscle. Now, if this pre-capillary sphincter means a ring of muscle, pre-capillary means before capillaries. If this donut-shaped muscle was told to contract, it also would reduce the flow past it. So if you combine arterial vasoconstriction, the narrowing of the arterioles, and pre-capillary sphincters contracting and constricting, narrowing, restricting the flow too, that's what controls our blood flow. And these two diagrams basically show dilation when the sphincter is open, when the arteriole is relaxed, blood can flow into this capillary bed and through it. And this side shows the constriction of an arteriole and the constriction of the precapillary sphincter, reducing or stopping flow into that capillary network and it just passing on by. So when you need to talk about what we call vasomotor control, remember vasomotor is to do with blood vessels and controlling the blood vessels by our autonomic nervous system. It's not just arterioles, it's arterioles and precapillary sphincters that control blood flow. So again, this is the last slide on precapillary sphincters. I suggest you pause the video, have a little read through. It's a smooth muscle, it's regulated by our autonomic nervous system without our conscious control. And actually, this directing blood or controlling blood flow or where blood is distributed is called the vascular shunt. And that's a really important term. So arterioles and precapillary sphincters control where blood is shunted, where blood is sent. And that is called the vascular shunt. If we want to send blood to our muscles, it's shunted there by these control mechanisms. If we want to shunt blood to our abdominal organs, then it's controlled by the arterioles and the precapillary sphincters. So that vascular shunt phrase is quite important for how we control the distribution of blood. Okay, moving on to capillaries then. Hopefully you know a little bit about capillaries already. We have pulmonary capillaries, we have systemic capillaries around in our body and around our muscles. Pulmonary capillaries are around our alveoli, and we know that they're really essential and their main function is for gas exchange. Now, by the time the blood gets to capillaries, it's actually only oozing. It's moving very slowly. The velocity has dropped quite a lot by the time it gets here. And we need it to be moving slowly because we need gas exchange to happen. The arteries take blood away from the heart, high velocity, high speed, high pressure. And as the blood is divided and sent through lots of different vessels, on the way to the capillaries, it slows down and slows down and slows down. It loses that push from the heart, loses that pump action. So blood flows through capillaries very slowly, and we describe that as oozing. And that's because we need it to be like that, because we need these capillaries to help us exchange gases. We need oxygen to be able to diffuse through them and CO2 to be able to diffuse through them. The wall, as you hopefully already know, is 1 cell thick. It's just got that endothelial tunica intima, the inner layer, and it allows gases to permeate through it easily. It's designed to allow that so. And it's designed to be really small, more or less the size of a red blood cell, because we want gas to have to travel a very, very short distance through the alveolar wall, which is 1 cell thick, through the capillary wall, which is 1 cell thick, through the really thin wall of the red blood cells. So same applies in the muscles, through the capillary wall into the muscle cell wall. So 1 cell thick, really important for the structure of capillaries. Whilst a bit like alveoli, whilst individually they are tiny and minuscule, we have so many of them that what we create with this vast network of capillaries is a huge surface area. And obviously, the more surface area we have, the more walls we have to diffuse gases through. Therefore, that makes our ability to exchange gases at the lungs and exchange gases at muscles really efficient. So structurally, it's designed with a 1 cell thick wall with a tiny diameter just big enough to have red blood cells pass through it, so that the gases have a very short distance to travel when they're diffusing between one place and another. And that is obviously the main function of capillaries, to enable diffusion to occur. Right, so venules. Venules is something you might not have heard of before. These basically are the vessels that drain blood from the capillary network into the venous system, the big veins, the bigger veins. So they're basically intermediate tubes that transfer blood from the capillaries into the veins, where we then return blood to the heart. There's not loads to say about them, other than you need to appreciate that they only have 2 of the 3 layers. They have the inner layer, the endothelial layer, and they have the outer tunica externa, the protective layer. They do not have smooth muscle, the tunica media. So there's no muscle in the venule wall. So they're the smallest of the types of veins. The capillaries are the smallest vessels altogether, but venules are the tiniest sort of veins. Mostly it's deoxygenated, and it's given the blood has just come through the capillary network, it's at really low pressure. It needs a bit of help to get blood back up to the heart. There's just the 2 layers, there's no smooth walls, and they basically connect to the veins. And the function of venules is to drain blood from the capillaries into the veins so that the veins can take the blood back to the heart. And that's really all you need to appreciate about venules. So the last of our 5 types of blood vessels, veins. So again, you hopefully should know that veins are the essential vessels that take blood to the heart, whether they're from the lungs or whether they're from parts of the body. Veins go towards the heart. It sounds stupid, I know, but it's the way I remembered. Arteries take blood away, veins go towards the heart. So again, we've got our sort of diagrammatic version on the right here, showing all the systems of the body returning blood to the heart. And this is a pulmonary vein. Please note the pulmonary vein is the only vein that carries oxygenated blood from the lungs back to the heart. All the other veins carry deoxygenated blood. And this is our more anatomical version. The 2 vessels you must know the names of are the pulmonary vein and the vena cava or the vena cava. So here's the inferior vena cava, returning blood through from the lower body to the heart. And then here, just about see it, is the superior vena cava, returning blood to the heart from the upper body. And again, you already know the term superior, inferior, from below, from above. Inferior vena cava, superior vena cava. You must know vena cava or vena cava. And then you must also know pulmonary vein, which I can show you on this side. It's not, I can't spot it on this side. So the pulmonary vein goes towards the heart, and you know from the word pulmonary that it's from the lungs to the left atrium. So let's summarize the structure and the function of the veins then. Veins have the biggest lumens, so the tube inside, the space inside, is the largest of all of the vessels. We need blood to flow easily through veins. We need to get blood back in veins, via veins, to the heart, so we need it to be easy. The blood at this point is not at high velocity like the arteries. We don't need as thick muscular walls as arteries because we have no force from the heart at this point. We actually need help to get blood back, often up against gravity. If I go back to this one, blood from our lower limbs needs to go upwards against gravity to get back to our heart to be pumped out. Whereas the arteries eject blood out from the pump of the heart and often goes down. So it's easier for the arteries in a way to distribute blood. Veins have a bigger job getting blood up through them against gravity. So they have the biggest lumen, the biggest space inside to try to aid flow back. And we call this flow back to the heart, we call it venous return. So they have a big lumen to aid venous return. They have all three layers. So they have the smooth endothelial layer, the tunica intima. They have the outer tunica externa, the fibrous protective layer, and they also have a tunica media, not as thick as the arteries, but there is some smooth muscle in that middle layer because veins can constrict. So the autonomic nervous system can stimulate that smooth muscle to constrict a bit, to narrow a bit, to try to help push blood through. That's called venomotor tone. Venomotor tone. V-E-N-O motor, M-O-T-O-R, venomotor tone, when there's a little bit of contraction there to constrict this tube. Now, because we've got to get blood up against gravity, we rely on other mechanisms, other strategies to help us push the blood back up, because the heart doesn't push the blood back. It only ejects the blood out. We've got to find these other ways of helping us get blood back. And the most important way is something we call the skeletal muscle pump. Now, this diagram shows that here. A lot of our big veins are situated near or between skeletal muscles, so our normal skeletal muscles. Now, if we are contracting our muscles and then relaxing our muscles, like if we were walking or jogging, we'd contract, relax, the shape of the muscle thickens and then narrows, thickens, then narrows. Now, when it thickens, basically, it pushes, it squeezes this vein. So if this gastrocnemius muscle was contracting, it would squeeze, and it shows it on this right side, squeeze the vein. And the blood inside that vein would be pushed upwards. Okay, so that's great, we're pushing blood upwards. But unfortunately, when this muscle relaxed, a bit like an ice pop, if you squeeze an ice pop, the ice goes up, but then if you take your fingers away, it wants to fall back down again. Now, to avoid that happening, major veins have these valves. They are one-way pocket valves. So when the blood is pushed up by the muscle squeezing the vein, that's great. The valve is pushed open, the blood pushes through the valve. But then when that muscle relaxes and the blood tries to come back down, it gets trapped in the pockets, and you can see that the valve would therefore shut. And the blood doesn't come down. So the next time the muscle contracts, when you're walking or stepping or running, more blood gets pushed up and then gets trapped. And it's like this ongoing massaging of the muscles, pushing regularly blood upwards. That's the most important way in which we return blood upwards against gravity to get it back to our heart. So we've got the skeletal muscle pump, the pumping action of the muscles, and we've got the pocket valves in veins. Really important for stopping backflow, for squeezing blood upwards and stopping backflow. One last thing to mention about veins, they're mostly superficial, so you can see a lot of people you can see the veins on the surface of their skin, whereas arteries tend to be a bit more deep, so deeper inside. We have to protect those arteries a lot, so we have to protect them. They're deeper inside our flesh, if you like, whereas the veins can often be a bit more near the skin surface. They're a bit more superficial. So I think that really covers the main things, the main factors of the 5 different blood vessels. Remember, you've got to know the name of those 4 main ones: aorta, pulmonary artery, pulmonary vein, and vena cava. Very last thing then, just to show the type of questions you might find. So the main function of capillary is gas exchange. Explain how 2 characteristics of the capillary are related to gas exchange. So it wants to know how it's structured, how it's designed, how it's built to fulfill that function. And then the mark scheme here talks about it being narrow, slow flow, one cell thick to allow easy, and semi-permeable to allow easy diffusion of those 2 gases. Or here we go, state 1 function of the following blood vessels. So what's the job of these 2 specific vessels? So you'd be expected to know that the pulmonary artery carries blood away from the heart to the lungs and it's deoxygenated, and that the aorta carries blood out of the heart to the body and it's oxygenated from the left ventricle. Identify a type of vessel that contains one-way valves. And there's a second part to this question, describe how arterioles control the flow of blood. So that's a really big question. So 1 mark, identify a vessel that contains one-way valves. 3 marks, describe how arterioles control blood flow. So they want to know about vascular shunt here. So here it is. You could have picked veins, I think is the most obvious one. Venules, some venules do, but I think veins are the main ones that have the one-way valves. Well, they've allowed you to name the main vein, that would be okay. And then here's the description of how arterioles control blood flow, this vascular shunt. So they've got smooth muscle in the wall that can dilate to increase flow, or because we want blood, this is asking you how does it allow blood to go to the muscles during exercise. So they can dilate to increase blood flow, and that's called vasodilation. So you're grabbing 3 marks out of those.